When HOA Karen called the cops to throw me off my own ranch, she didn't know I was the man who oversees every HOA in America, and her empire of fines was about to crumble. After years working in Washington, I returned to my family ranch, a place of open skies, barbed wire fences, and cattle trails worn into the earth. I wanted peace, not politics. But peace wasn't waiting for me. The moment I parked my truck, a woman stormed over with a clipboard in hand. Her name was Karen, and she claimed she was head of the local HOA. She pointed to my truck, my gate, even my dog, rattling off violations. I chuckled. She had no idea who I was. By dusk, the crickets had just begun their song, a low hum that floated across the open fields like a warning of its own. My ranch stretched far beyond the reach of the headlights that crept down the county road, a sea of grass and oak trees that had stood longer than most families in this town had even been alive. I thought I was done for the day, boots off, dinner warming in the oven, when I noticed something stuck to the wooden post of my front fence. A letter. Not just any letter. This one was bold, screaming at me in block letters across the top. Notice of violation. Immediate compliance required. The words bled arrogance, the kind of arrogance only someone like Karen could have. The self-appointed queen of cul-de-sacs, the tyrant of trimmed hedges, the unchallenged dictator of mailbox heights and paint shades. I almost laughed. Truly I did. The paper flapped in the evening wind, as if even it was embarrassed to be there, like a stray that had wandered too far from home. What did Karen think she was doing? My land didn't stop at a picket fence or a postage stamp backyard. My land stretched across hundreds of acres, soil richer than the paper her silly notice was printed on, deeds signed long before this so-called neighborhood even existed. This ranch wasn't just property, it was legacy. My grandfather had worked it with his bare hands, my father had held it through storms and droughts, and now it was mine. And yet, here was Karen, thinking she could slap a notice on my fence and command me like I was one of her HOA minions. But Karen didn't know. She didn't know the nights I'd spent in Washington, the endless policy briefings, the battles fought behind closed doors where real power was negotiated and carved out like marble statues. She didn't know that while she was measuring grass blades with a ruler, I was drafting federal oversight mandates that dictated how organizations like hers even operated. Because I wasn't just a rancher. Not anymore. I was the newly appointed Federal Oversight Director of Homeowners Associations. And that meant every HOA in the United States, every smug Karen, every clipboard-wielding neighbor with too much free time answered to me. I held the letter in my hands a little longer than I should have. The paper crackled as I folded it once, then again, sliding it neatly into my jacket pocket. Not because it scared me, but because it was proof. Proof of Karen's ignorance. Proof of her audacity, proof of how far she would go to try and impose her tiny suburban rules on land she couldn't begin to understand. The irony stung in the best way. For decades, people like Karen had built empires out of fines, out of neighborly intimidation, out of wielding control where none was deserved. I had watched it happen while serving in Washington. Families losing their homes over grass height violations. Veterans fined for flying their flags incorrectly, widows harassed for leaving a flower pot unapproved by the aesthetic committee. It sickened me then. It enraged me now. That's why I'd taken this job. Not for the paycheck, not for the prestige, but for the power to finally put people like Karen in their place. And now fate had delivered her right to my doorstep, tapping her notice on my fence like a challenge. I imagined Karen at her kitchen table earlier that evening, sipping a glass of boxed wine, her lips pinched as she scribbled the words that would soon find their way into my hands. Maybe she smirked as she sealed the envelope, thinking of the look on my face when I read it. But here's the thing, Karen didn't know my face. Not the real one. She knew the rancher, the man who drove a beat-up pickup and wore a Stetson to the feed store. She didn't know the man who sat in Washington briefing senators, who could draft a single order that would strip her entire HOA board of their authority. Overnight, she didn't know that the same man she was trying to bully had the legal power to dismantle her kingdom brick by brick. As the sun sank lower, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, I leaned against the fence and watched the lights flicker on in the neighborhood down the hill. Each porch lamp, each glowing window, was a reminder they thought they owned this land. They thought their HOA bylaws had weight here. But they were wrong. This was my land, my ranch, my authority. And soon, they would learn that the same Karen who handed out fines for trash cans left on the curb was nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. I could almost taste the justice waiting to unfold. That night, long after the stars had claimed the sky, I sat at my oak desk inside the ranch house. I spread the letter across the wood grain like it was evidence in a trial. I picked up my fountain pen, the same one I had used to sign my federal appointment papers just 3 months earlier, and began drafting my own notice. Not to Karen directly. No, to her entire HOA board. Because if Karen wanted to play this game, then I would show her what it looked like when someone with real authority decided to move the pieces. What Karen didn't understand was that power didn't come from a neighborhood newsletter or a clipboard. Power came from laws, from oversight, from the weight of Washington behind your name. And for the first time in her life, Karen was about to be on the receiving end of notice that couldn't be laughed off, ignored, or appealed at a petty board meeting. This was no longer about grass height or fence color or mailbox design. This was about who really ruled the land. And as I signed my name across the bottom of the page, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had delivered her warning. Now it was my turn. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I heard it. Low rumbling tires on gravel, then the piercing reflection of red and blue lights bouncing off my bedroom walls. For a second, half asleep, I thought I was dreaming. My ranch was a place of silence at dawn, where the only sound came from cicadas and the occasional distant call of cattle. Sirens didn't belong here. I pushed myself out of bed and walked barefoot to the window. Sure enough, a sheriff's cruiser idled by my front gate, lights spinning like an alarm clock I hadn't set. Dust kicked up around it, mingling with the cool morning air. Karen, only she would think flashing lights could scare me off my own land. I pulled on my boots and stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath me. From where I stood, I could see her. Karen was perched behind the deputy, one hand on her hip, the other waving papers in the air like some twisted declaration of independence. Her voice carried across the field, shrill, sharp, cutting through the morning stillness like broken glass. "There he is," she screeched, jabbing her finger in my direction. "That man is trespassing on our HOA's property." I didn't move at first. I let her words hang in the air, absurd and desperate. The deputy, poor kid, barely older than 30, shifted uneasily as he adjusted his belt. I recognized him instantly. Deputy Collins, son of a rancher himself, grew up not more than 20 miles from here. His boots told me more than his badge did. They were scuffed, worn, the kind of boots that had seen real mud, not just pavement. He looked at me. His eyes widened. His face drained of color. "Sir," he stammered, voice barely audible over Karen's ranting, I didn't know this was your property." That sentence alone silenced the birds for a moment. But not Karen. She lunged forward, nearly bumping into Colin's shoulder, her lips curled in fury. "Don't you dare listen to him," she snapped. "He's lying. This isn't his ranch anymore. Our HOA board voted, and his land falls under our jurisdiction now. He doesn't have the right to live here without our approval." Her words dripped with venom, but to me, they sounded almost comical, like a child stamping her feet in a sandbox, claiming ownership of the sand. I descended the porch steps slowly, deliberately. Each step echoed in the morning quiet. When I reached the bottom, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and pulled out 2 things, my driver's license and a black leather case embossed with the federal seal. First, I handed Collins the license. He glanced at it, nodding quickly, confirming what he already knew. Then I opened the leather case with a quiet snap and tilted it just enough for him to see. The golden badge glinted in the sunrise. Federal Oversight Director of Homeowners Associations. Collins' jaw dropped. His mouth moved, but no words came. The color returned to his face in a rush. Only this time, it was a shade of embarrassment. He looked at Karen, then back at me, his posture shifting instantly from cautious authority to near-respectful deference. Karen's voice caught mid-yell. For the first time since I'd known her, she was silent. I let the silence stretch. The lights from the cruiser cast wild streaks of red and blue across her face, and in them I saw something I hadn't before: doubt. She wasn't used to this. Karen was used to people cowering, to neighbors apologizing, to committees bending under her endless rules. She wasn't used to facing someone who could crush her with nothing more than a signature. "Deputy," I said at last, my voice steady, calm, with just the faintest edge of authority. "You've been called here under false pretenses. This land has been in my family for generations. The deeds are on file with the county clerk if you'd like to verify. But more importantly," I tilted the badge again, catching the sun, "every HOA in this state, in this country, falls under my oversight." Collins nodded quickly, almost too quickly, like a soldier receiving orders. "Understood, sir." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She looked like a fish gasping for air on dry land. Finally, she managed a strangled word. "While what?" Her eyes darted between me and the deputy. "That can't be real. He's bluffing. He's just a rancher. Look at him." I almost smiled at that. She still thought of me as just a rancher. That was her mistake. She didn't know the halls I had walked in Washington, the doors that had opened for me, the legislation I had helped craft to rein in exactly this kind of petty tyranny. My mind flickered back, unbidden, to my first day in D.C. as Federal Oversight Director. I had stood in a chamber lined with portraits of men who shaped the country: presidents, senators, reformers. The air was thick with history and responsibility. I had taken an oath that day, my right hand raised, my voice firm, to protect the rights of homeowners, to prevent abuses of power, and to ensure that no association or individual exploits authority over the American people. Those words echoed in my head now, standing in front of Karen and her paper-thin accusations. "Deputy Collins," I said, "please record in your report that Ms. Karen here has knowingly made a false claim of trespassing, attempted to usurp authority over land outside of her HOA's jurisdiction, and interfered with lawful property rights." His pen was out before I even finished. Karen turned pale, then red, then pale again. She sputtered, grasping for excuses for some last shred of control. "You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. I have authority." "No, Karen," I said quietly, firmly, as the flashing lights painted the morning sky. "You never did. You only thought you did." Her face twisted, but her words failed her. And in that moment, watching Karen crumble in silence while the deputy scribbled in his notepad, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen had tried to bring the law to my doorstep. She hadn't realized I carried a higher law in my back pocket. The warning was over. The war had just begun. Karen had made her move. She thought she could break me with paper fines, with notices taped to fences, with loud accusations yelled from behind a deputy's shoulder. She thought intimidation worked on everyone because it had worked on neighbors for years. But Karen had underestimated one thing: me. She was playing a neighborhood game. I was playing federal chess. That same night, long after the flashing lights had faded from my land and the deputy's cruiser disappeared into the distance, I sat in my office at the ranch house. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over stacks of papers and legal codes, shadows stretching across maps of my land pinned on the wall. I pulled out a single sheet, typed in the precise language I had written myself when I first stepped into office. It was part of the federal charter for HOA oversight, a clause designed exactly for this kind of abuse. Any HOA subject to credible allegations of misconduct may be placed under immediate federal review, with full authority granted to auditors to inspect, evaluate, and suspend board operations pending investigation. I filled in the blanks. Subject of review: Willow Creek Estates, HOA. Reason for review: harassment of landowners, financial misconduct allegations, unlawful jurisdictional claims. Requested by Federal Oversight Director, my name, signed in ink. The paper carried more weight than Karen could ever imagine. Her little fines, her angry letters, her threats, they were nothing compared to this. This wasn't a neighborly dispute. This was Washington putting its boot on her throat. I sealed the document and sent it through federal channels before midnight. By sunrise, The storm had already been set in motion. Within 24 hours, black SUVs rolled into Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood that prided itself on manicured lawns and pastel shutters now watched as men and women in suits stepped out with briefcases, clipboards, and federal seals stitched onto their jackets. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering. Kids paused in their bike rides, staring at the spectacle. The auditors didn't smile, didn't hesitate. They marched straight to the HOA clubhouse, the glass-fronted building Karen loved to boast about at every meeting. Its sign read, Willow Creek HOA Headquarters, established 1996, as if it were some hallowed institution. Today, it became a crime scene. Karen was there, of course. She stormed out of the clubhouse in a pastel blazer, heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "You can't just barge in here," she shouted, blocking the doorway. "This is private property. This is our business." The lead auditor, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a voice like steel, didn't flinch. She held up a document sealed with the federal emblem. "By order of the Federal Oversight Director, this HOA is under immediate review. Step aside, ma'am." Karen's face turned scarlet. She sputtered, gesturing wildly at the neighbors. "He's behind this. That rancher. He's abusing power." But the auditors were already inside, ignoring her shrieks. Clipboards opened. Computers hummed to life. Filing cabinets were unlocked. Karen was no longer in charge. The truth spilled fast. Within hours, the auditors uncovered misuse of funds. Tens of thousands of dollars allocated for landscaping that never happened. Checks written to companies that didn't exist. HOA dues funneled into consulting fees that led straight back to Karen's personal accounts. Worse still were the complaints. One binder after another revealed letters from residents, dozens of them, who had been harassed, fined, and threatened for petty violations. An elderly veteran fined for a flagpole. A young couple bullied into repainting their home twice in 1 year. A widow forced to sell her property after Karen buried her in penalties she could never pay. Neighbors who had once feared speaking out now stepped forward, voices trembling but strong. They told auditors of meetings where Karen belittled them, of threats that if they didn't comply, she would make their lives hell. And then came the embezzlement. An entire section of the HOA's account was missing. Funds had been withdrawn in cash, routed through multiple banks, and disguised as community improvements that never materialized. Karen's perfect HOA wasn't just flawed, it was rotting from the inside out. I didn't need to be there in person to witness it. My phone lit up all day with updates, auditor reports, legal findings, even photos of Karen screaming on the clubhouse steps as federal agents carried out box after box of documents. Neighbors texted me too. Some were short, "Thank you." Others longer, full of relief, gratitude, even apology for ever siding with her. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. This was just the first strike. Karen had built her empire on fear, and fear doesn't vanish overnight. People like her don't go down with one blow. They claw, they bite, they lash out until the last possible moment. And I knew Karen would. She had tasted power for too long to let it go quietly. That night, I stood again at my porch fence, the same spot where her notice had once flapped in the wind. The crickets sang, the air smelled of dust and mesquite, but now the neighborhood below felt different. Quiet, uneasy, watching. Karen had thought she could intimidate me with petty fines. Instead, I had brought Washington to her doorstep. And as I looked down at the distant glow of the clubhouse, where auditors still worked late into the night, I whispered to myself, this is only the beginning. Because I wasn't finished. Not even close. It happened faster than I thought. Word spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire, carried on porch gossip, late-night texts, and whispers exchanged over white fences. Yesterday, Karen was untouchable, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, wielding fines like swords. But today her empire was crumbling. Neighbors who had lived for years under the weight of her threats suddenly saw cracks in her armor. They saw the federal SUVs. They saw the auditors in their pressed suits, walking out of the clubhouse with boxes of records. They saw Karen screaming in the parking lot while the law ignored her. For the first time in years, people realized something that terrified Karen more than anything else. She wasn't in charge anymore. The first sign came in the form of silence. On Monday mornings, Willow Creek Estates was usually alive with the sound of leaf blowers, hired crews trimming hedges to meet aesthetic requirements, neighbors rushing to pull their trash cans back before Karen could issue fines. But that morning, the silence was eerie. No landscapes, no frantic neighbors. Trash cans lingered on curbs, unbothered. Lawns went untrimmed. It was as if the entire neighborhood collectively decided, no more. By noon, the silence turned into defiance. Residents who once wrote checks to the HOA with trembling hands now left envelopes unopened on their counters. Dues went unpaid. Violation notices sat crumpled in recycling bins. I watched it happen from the porch of my ranch house. One by one, neighbors began to drift up the gravel road toward my fence line. At first, they were cautious, looking over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones. But when they saw others already standing there, something changed. One old man, mustache gray and hands calloused, extended his hand across the fence. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice cracked. "I've lived here 30 years. She fined me $500 because my grandson left his skateboard on the driveway overnight. I didn't know how much more I could take." I shook his hand firmly. Another came, a young mother with 2 kids tugging at her dress. Her eyes welled up as she whispered, "She made us tear down a swing set because it wasn't approved." My kids cried for weeks. "Thank you for standing up to her." Then another, and another. The fence that once divided my ranch from the subdivision became a gathering place, a quiet line of solidarity. Neighbors leaned against the rails, shook my hand, patted my shoulder, whispered their gratitude like confessions. For years they had been too afraid to speak. Now they couldn't stop. But Karen wasn't finished. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the low growl of her SUV before I saw it. She came barreling down the street, her tires screeching as she pulled to a stop just across from the fence. Her window rolled down, and there she was, face red, hair frazzled, lips pulled back in a snarl. Her voice tore through the air. "You think this is over? You think you've won? I'll take you down. I'll take all of you down." The neighbors froze. Old instincts kicked in, fear, hesitation. For years, they had bowed to this voice. But now, with the auditor's cars still parked by the clubhouse, with her corruption already exposed, the fear didn't stick. One by one, they turned their backs to her. Karen screamed louder, her voice cracking, spittle flying from her lips. "You're all weak. Ungrateful. This is my neighborhood. Do you hear me? Mine." Her SUV jolted forward a few feet, as if she considered driving straight through the fence. Gasps erupted, but then she slammed the brakes, tires spitting gravel, and sped off down the road. The silence she left behind was heavier than her words. That evening, as the sun set gold across the horizon, more neighbors arrived. They brought lemonade, pie, even folding chairs. They didn't just thank me, they stayed. Some told stories I hadn't heard before. A retired teacher fined for planting wildflowers because they were non-compliant. A family nearly bankrupted by Karen's repeated demands to repaint their home. A teenager threatened with expulsion from the community pool because his shorts were the wrong shade of blue. Each story was worse than the last. Each one proved Karen's reign hadn't been leadership. It had been tyranny. And with every story, with every laugh shared across my fence line, her power drained a little more. Karen must have driven by half a dozen times that night. Her SUV slowed, headlights sweeping across the group gathered by my ranch. But this time she didn't shout. She didn't stop. She only watched. Her face, once smug and untouchable, was twisted now, half rage, half fear. She could see it slipping away. She could feel the neighborhood turning against her. The Queen of Willow Creek was being dethroned, not by force, not by violence, but by the simple act of people standing together. Later, when the crowd finally dispersed, I leaned against the fence and stared out at the subdivision. Porch lights twinkled like stars against the dark. For the first time, the neighborhood felt alive, not in fear but in freedom. Karen had ruled with intimidation. I hadn't lifted a weapon, hadn't raised my voice. All I had done was shine light on the truth. And light was something Karen couldn't survive in. Still, I knew her type. Cornered animals don't surrender. They attack. And Karen was about to learn that every strike she launched would only bring her closer to the end. The call came just after sunrise, when the cool air still carried the damp scent of the fields and the faint chirping of crickets still lingered against the horizon. My coffee hadn't even cooled in the mug when the first ring buzzed through my phone. It wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Washington. Director Hayes, a familiar voice, chuckled on the other end. I hear you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest. I recognized Senator Bracken immediately. Old, gruff, and blunt as a rusted horseshoe, he didn't bother with pleasantries. His words carried both amusement and approval. You're telling me you've got the infamous Karen on your doorstep? Lord, we've been hearing complaints about her HOA for years. Half my staff used to joke that if one person could take down an entire homeowners association racket, it'd be her, or someone who survived her. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the land that stretched endlessly in every direction. She picked the wrong fence to tape her notice to Senator. She's barking up a tree that's rooted in Washington's law itself. He laughed heartily. You've got backing, Hayes. Don't let her scare you. Hell, I might bring this up in committee next week. An HOA president trying to bully the federal oversight director out of his own ranch. You can't make this stuff up. I thanked him, but I knew the storm was just brewing. If Washington had caught wind, that meant Karen's antics had already spread beyond our county. Word traveled fast when politics were involved, and the irony was too delicious for them to ignore. The overseer of every HOA in America was under siege by the very kind of petty tyrant he was sworn to regulate. But instead of being cowed, Karen escalated. She didn't just double down, she went nuclear. By mid-afternoon, another envelope appeared, this one shoved beneath my gate. It wasn't just another notice of violation. It was 3 stapled pages of threats, legal jargon strung together by a Google search, and a bold proclamation in handwriting scrawled at the bottom. You'll regret this. I'll take you down, badge or not. Her obsession with power was turning rabid. The threats begin. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, I noticed something different near the ranch gate. Heavy chains wrapped through the metal bars, locked shut with a padlock. My padlock was gone. Karen had taken it upon herself to secure my property as if I were a squatter trespassing on her imaginary kingdom. I laughed under my breath, half in disbelief, half in fury. The sheriff's deputy rolled up not 20 minutes later, likely called in by Karen herself. But this wasn't the same deputy from before. This one, younger and less seasoned, stepped out with uncertainty painted across his face. Sir, we got a complaint. Says you're blocking access to community land with a gate. Community land. She was calling my private ranch common space. Deputy, I said evenly, reaching into my truck to grab the paperwork. This is my deed. This land predates every cul-de-sac in her subdivision by 60 years. And if you want to check this, I pulled out the federal ID, the seal glinting in the fading light. You'll see who you're really talking to. He looked at the badge, swallowed hard, then looked at the chains. So, she did this. She did this, I confirmed, which means she's now tampering with federal property. He didn't argue. In fact, he called in backup, not for me, but for her. I stood back as bolt cutters snapped through the chain, the metal clattering against the dirt like the first shot in a war. Karen watched from the road, her SUV idling like a predator in the brush. I could see her silhouette through the windshield, phone glued to her ear, no doubt spinning another frantic story to anyone who would listen. But this time, she wasn't fooling anyone. Bogus lawsuits. The next week became a parade of nonsense. Every morning, without fail, my mailbox was stuffed with more legal papers. Karen had apparently decided to represent herself, filing lawsuit after lawsuit in the county courthouse. Trespassing, harassment, violation of community aesthetics. She even accused me of illegally housing livestock. I glanced at the complaint, then at my cattle grazing in the field beyond. illegally housing livestock on a cattle ranch. It would have been laughable if it weren't so desperate. I knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't about winning. It was about wearing me down. Lawsuits cost time, money, and energy. She wanted to bury me in paperwork until I either gave up or slipped. But what she didn't know was that I had an entire federal legal team watching her every move. Every bogus complaint she filed went into a growing binder on my desk labeled Karen versus Reality. And with every page, she wasn't digging my grave, she was digging her own. Washington watches closer. By the second week, the calls from Washington weren't just check-ins. They were formal. Director Hayes, Senator Bracken's aide, said one evening, "We're convening a subcommittee review. Karen's HOA isn't just a local nuisance anymore. She's crossed into federal misconduct. Your office will need to present findings." The irony was as sharp as barbed wire. Karen thought she was burying me under threats and lawsuits, but in reality, she was stacking evidence high enough to tower over her HOA's entire history. I leaned back, staring at the growing pile of folders on my desk. "Trust me," I said, "by the time this review is over, her HOA won't just lose power. It'll cease to exist." Karen's desperation. Karen must have felt her grip slipping because her behavior turned erratic. One night, I caught her SUV creeping past my ranch fence at 2 a.m, headlights off, just idling like a wolf testing the edge of campfire. Another day, neighbors whispered to me that Karen had been knocking on doors, begging for signatures to oust the outsider. Some laughed in her face. Others slammed the door. A few, terrified of her wrath, reluctantly signed. But the tide was shifting. For the first time, people were seeing her not as a protector of property values, but as a tyrant unraveling in public. The turning point. One evening, as I walked the fence line, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Washington. It was a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years, a quiet, older man who lived at the far end of the development. "You've got to know something," he said nervously. "Karen's not just filing lawsuits. She's digging. She's calling contacts, paying for records. She's trying to find something, anything, to use against you." I smiled to myself. "Let her dig," I said softly. "Every shovel she lifts just buries her deeper." Because what Karen didn't realize was simple. I'd already built my case long before she taped that first notice to my fence. She thought this was about a single ranch, a single man standing against her HOA. But Washington knew better. This was about the entire system of abuse that HOAs had become across America. And Karen was about to become the example. The moment had been building for weeks. Every letter taped to my fence, every bogus lawsuit shoved in my mailbox, every midnight drive-by of Karen's SUV. I knew the time was coming when the warnings would no longer be enough. And on a stormy Thursday morning, with thunder rattling the windows of my study, I signed the order myself. Federal takeover of HOA number 417, the preserve at Willow Creek. My pen glided across the paper with deliberate calm, but the signature carried the weight of a hammer. With that stroke of ink, Karen's empire, her fortress of power and intimidation, collapsed like rotted wood under a boot. Within hours, Washington acted, dissolving the board. Federal agents in dark SUVs rolled into the neighborhood just as the sun broke through the storm clouds. Their presence was swift and silent, professional in the way that left no room for argument. The HOA board, once Karen's loyal inner circle, was summoned to the community center. Inside, auditors and federal attorneys waited with clipboards and binders. "This is an official federal takeover," one agent announced, voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence. "As of this morning, the Willow Creek HOA board has been dissolved. All funds are frozen pending investigation. You're no longer authorized to enforce bylaws, collect dues, or issue fines." Gasps rippled across the room. A few board members tried to protest, waving their hands and sputtering excuses. But the agents didn't flinch. Every seat of power was stripped away in minutes. One man, the treasurer, a nervous fellow who had always followed Karen like a shadow, nearly broke down in tears. "She told us we had protection. She said no one could touch us." The agent raised an eyebrow. "She was wrong. The letters. That same morning, as the board's authority dissolved, letters were slipped into every mailbox in the neighborhood. Official, stamped with the seal of the Federal Oversight Office. The words were simple but seismic. Effective immediately, all fines, liens, and dues previously enforced by the Willow Creek HOA are suspended. No further payments are required until further notice. Neighbors opened the envelopes on their porches, in their kitchens, beside their mailboxes. And as the words sank in, disbelief turned to joy. For the first time in years, families felt the weight of Karen's grip loosen from their throats. One man across the street shouted loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear, "She can't take my truck anymore. It's finally over." Others gathered in small clusters, clutching the papers like emancipation orders. I watched from my porch as laughter, relief, even tears rippled through the community. Fear was giving way to freedom. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and everyone knew it. Karen's fury. But Karen herself? She didn't take it with grace. By late afternoon, the sound of tires screeching up my gravel driveway shattered the calm. Her white SUV fishtailed to a stop just short of the ranch gate, dust clouding the air around her. The door flew open, and Karen stormed out, face blotched red, eyes blazing like a woman possessed. "You ruined me," she screamed, her voice echoing against the fields. "Do you hear me? Ruin." She marched right up to the fence, gripping the bars so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her whole body shook with rage. "You froze my accounts. You dissolved my board. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" I stepped out slowly, calm as the breeze that rustled the grass behind me. My boots crunched against the gravel, every step deliberate. I met her eyes across the fence, steady, unflinching. "I didn't ruin your life," I said evenly. "You did that yourself." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, the fury cracked, replaced by something hollow. Fear, maybe, or realization. Then the rage returned, hotter than before. "You think this is over?" she spat. "I'll appeal. I'll sue Washington itself, if I have to." I tilted my head, voice low but sharp. "Every move you make now goes into a federal record, Karen. Keep pushing, and you won't just lose your HOA. You'll lose everything." The breaking point. She screamed incoherently, words lost in the raw anger of a woman watching her empire collapse. But the neighborhood was watching too. Residents gathered on sidewalks, whispering, filming with phones, capturing the moment the tyrant who once ruled them with fines and threats came undone. Her power was gone. Her control was gone. And for the first time, she had no one left to intimidate. When she realized no one was stepping in to defend her, not the board, not the sheriff, not the neighbors, her voice faltered. She looked around, wild-eyed, as if waiting for someone to restore her throne. But the silence was louder than her screams. She climbed back in her SUV, slammed the door so hard it rattled, and sped off down the road. The dust she left behind felt like the closing curtain of a long, bitter play. The crackdown spreads. But it didn't stop there. The case against her HOA rippled outward, reaching other neighborhoods, other counties, other states. News outlets picked up the story. Federal director takes down rogue HOA in landmark case. Karen had become the poster child for everything wrong with homeowners associations. The abuse, the greed, the corruption. And Washington seized the chance to act. Audits expanded. Investigations opened. Other bullies who once hid behind bylaws and boards suddenly found federal eyes on their accounts. And all of it started with a single letter taped to my fence. Aftermath on the ranch. That night, the ranch was quiet again. The cattle grazed under the moonlight, the air cool and clean after the day's storm. I sat on the porch, listening to the cicadas, the kind of silence that only comes when a battle has finally ended. But I knew this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about something bigger, about proving that no matter how loud, how petty, or how ruthless a bully becomes, the law is louder. Karen had thought herself untouchable. She had built her kingdom on fear. But kingdoms built on fear crumble fastest when the people no longer bow. And now, thanks to the crackdown, Karen was no longer a queen. She was just another name in a federal file marked. Case closed. It began with a headline. The local paper ran it first, a black and white photo of me standing at my ranch gate with federal agents in the background. HOA tyrant taken down by federal oversight director. By dawn, the story had jumped from our small county paper to state outlets. By noon, cable networks had it plastered across their tickers. And by evening, the entire country knew the name Karen Whitfield and the name of the man who finally stopped her. Me. The cameras arrive. The following morning, the silence of the ranch shattered under the hum of vans, tripods, and satellite dishes. Journalists crowded along the fence line, shouting questions as if I were walking into Congress itself. Director Hayes, is it true you personally signed the federal takeover order? Do you think HOAs across the nation should be afraid now? What do you say to homeowners who call you a hero? I wasn't used to it. My life had been one of quiet work, first in Washington's halls, then back here on my land. But now, my porch had become a podium. Karen, too, became a fixture on the screen, but in an entirely different light. Gone was the pristine queen of her cul-de-sac. The cameras caught her storming out of county courtrooms, hair disheveled, shouting about conspiracies. Clips of her red-faced rants went viral overnight. One late-night host joked, "If HOA presidents are neighborhood dictators, Karen just crowned herself Napoleon, without the empire." Laughter echoed across the nation, but for Karen, it was humiliation. Homeowners across America. The real shift wasn't the laughter, though, it was the relief. Emails poured into my federal office by the thousands. Handwritten letters arrived at the ranch, some from as far as Oregon, Maine, even Alaska. Homeowners who had been silenced, fined, or threatened by their own HOAs wrote to me like I had just freed them personally. "Mr. Hayes, I thought no one would ever stand up to these bullies. You gave me hope. You didn't just protect your ranch. You protected all of us." For the first time, I feel like someone is watching the watchers. One box arrived from a family in Texas. Inside was a handmade wooden plaque, carved with the words, "Property of no one." I hung it in my study above the very desk where Karen's first violation notice still sat pinned like a trophy. Washington reacts. It didn't take long for Washington to catch the fever. Committees were formed. Hearings were scheduled. Senators who had once brushed off HOA complaints now quoted my case as proof that reform was overdue. C-SPAN cameras broadcast my testimony live as I sat beneath the glaring lights of the Capitol Dome. Before me stretched rows of lawmakers, papers stacked high, microphones blinking red. "Director Hayes," one senator asked, "what do you say to the millions of Americans living under the thumb of abusive HOAs?" I didn't flinch. "I say what happened in Willow Creek is not an isolated case," I answered firmly. "It is a symptom of a broken system, one where small boards of unelected individuals wield unchecked power over families' homes, livelihoods, and peace of mind. That ends now." Applause broke out, not just in the room, but across the country as the words aired live. Karen's collapse. Meanwhile, Karen couldn't escape the spotlight either. Paparazzi followed her from grocery stores to gas stations. Every courtroom appearance became a spectacle. One infamous clip showed her standing on the courthouse steps, jabbing her finger at reporters. "This is a witch hunt. He's not a hero, he's a fraud." But her words rang hollow. Behind her, former HOA members, once terrified of her, now held signs that read, "Free at last," and "No more Karen's Kingdom." The nation watched as her downfall played out in real time, and the more she screamed, the more people saw her for what she was, a petty tyrant exposed. From rancher to. For me, the strangest part wasn't the cameras or the committees or the headlines. It was the shift in how people looked at me. Neighbors didn't just wave anymore. They approached with gratitude heavy in their voices. Strangers stopped me at gas stations to shake my hand. Families asked for photos on the courthouse steps. I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I had become something larger, a symbol of resistance. Resistance against fear. Resistance against unchecked power. Resistance against the creeping idea that one's home belonged more to a board than to the family living inside it. And though the weight of that symbol was heavy, I carried it with pride. The movement begins. Across the country, Movements sprang up like prairie grass after a rainstorm. Social media campaigns used my case as a rallying cry. Hashtag end HOA abuse. Hashtag homes for families. Hashtag no more Karens. Petitions flooded state houses demanding new oversight, new protections, new laws. And as the pressure mounted, states began to listen. California announced its own review board. Florida tightened restrictions. Even Texas, the birthplace of sprawling HOA communities, introduced legislation curbing their reach. It was no longer just my fight. It was a national one, a quiet night on the ranch. Yet even with the world watching, the ranch never changed. The cattle still grazed under the same wide sky. The wind still carried the scent of mesquite and soil. The porch still creaked under my boots as I sat with a fresh cup of coffee. But now, when I looked out at the horizon, I knew something had shifted. What started with a single letter taped to my fence had grown into a movement that stretched from coast to coast. Karen had tried to break me. Instead, she broke herself. And in the ashes of her collapse, a fire caught hold across America. For the first time in decades, homeowners felt free. And as the stars blinked alive above the ranch, I realized the truth. This fight was never about me alone. It was about every family who just wanted to live in peace on their own land. On the national stage, I wasn't just the man who ran a ranch. I was the man who proved no tyrant, no matter how small her kingdom, could stand forever. For weeks, she had been unraveling in public, ranting on courthouse steps, storming into town meetings, calling every TV station that would still pick up her line. But even humiliation has a breaking point, and Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly into the night. She needed one last act, one final attempt to reclaim control. And she chose my ranch as the stage. The night of the break-in. It was late, well past midnight, when a motion sensors on the east pasture fence tripped. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a security alert. I blinked awake, groggy at first, until the next alert followed. Barn entrance, movement detected. I sat up straight. By the time I opened the live feed, the cameras were already locked onto her. Karen. She was dressed head to toe in black, her hair tied back, a can of spray paint clutched in her hand. Her movements were frantic, jerky, like someone teetering on the edge of sanity. She kicked at the barn door until it gave way, stumbling inside as if she were storming an enemy fortress. The night was silent except for the faint hiss of the paint can and the scratch of her voice muttering curses under her breath. The message she tried to leave. On the barn wall, she scrawled in big, dripping letters. Traitor, liar, this land is mine. The words were crooked, uneven, the work of someone too consumed by rage to think straight. She turned, as if to add more, when the red-blue flash of approaching headlights cut across the field. The deputies. They had been monitoring her for weeks, waiting for the moment when her threats turned to action. And now they had all they needed. The arrest. Karen Whitfield, one deputy shouted as they stepped out of their cruiser, flashlights slicing through the dark. Put the kin down. Step away from a barn. She froze, shoulders heaving, spray trembling in her grip. For a moment, I thought she might resist, might make a scene worthy of the viral videos she had become infamous for. Instead, she dropped the can, the rattle echoing across the quiet ranch. It's not fair, she sobbed, her voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. You ruined everything. Everything. That was my neighborhood. My rules. My world. The deputies moved in quickly, handcuffs clinking in the night. Karen Whitfield, you're under arrest for vandalism, trespassing, and violation of a federal order, one deputy said flatly. Her scream pierced the air as they led her toward the cruiser, a mixture of fury and despair, but it carried no power anymore. No one rushed to her defense. No board members, no allies, no frightened neighbors. Just the sound of the barn door creaking and the steady hum of the cruiser's engine. My choice. Inside the house, I sat on the edge of my bed, the glow of the security feed still casting light across the room. I could have watched it all, the struggle, the shouting, the deputies loading her into the back seat. But I didn't. I closed the feed. Because Karen wasn't my problem anymore. The nation's example. By morning, the footage was already in federal hands. Within hours, it spread across every major network. Clips of Karen spray painting threats on my barn played side by side with her old speeches about protecting property values. The hypocrisy was too rich to ignore. From HOA queen to felon, one anchor said with a shake of his head. America's most infamous neighbor, another joked. Karen's last stand, the headlines read. The nation didn't see a victim. They saw the inevitable end of unchecked arrogance. And as I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise spill gold across the fields, I realized that Karen's downfall was no longer about me, or even Willow Creek. It was a warning etched in spray paint and handcuffs for every HOA tyrant who thought fear was power. Her story was over. But the movement her downfall had sparked was only just beginning. The weeks after Karen's arrest passed like a slow-moving storm clearing the skies. My ranch, once the center of chaos and petty harassment, had returned to its rightful peace. The longhorns grazed lazily in the pastures, their silhouettes stretching against the glowing horizon, while the cicadas hummed their timeless chorus. From my porch, coffee in hand, I watched it all and realized something profound. This land, this life, this freedom hadn't just been defended. It had been fortified. The fences that Karen once claimed were unsightly now stood stronger than ever, reinforced by neighbors who had come together to help mend and repaint them. My barn, the same one she tried to vandalize, had been freshly restored. Where Karen saw control, I saw community. Where she tried to build a fiefdom, I had helped ignite unity. But the peace of the ranch was only part of the story. Across the nation, the shockwaves of Karen's downfall spread like wildfire. News anchors called me the Overseer, a title I hadn't asked for, but one that now followed me everywhere. To some, it sounded almost biblical, a guardian against corruption. To others, it was political ammunition. Senators, governors, even federal judges cited my case as an example of unchecked HOA tyranny and why oversight was long overdue. I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I was the symbol of a fight most people never thought they could win. Letters poured into my office by the thousands. Veterans, widows, young families, all telling the same story. Of bullies in boardrooms who abused power, of neighbors fined for things as trivial as the color of their shutters or the type of flowers in their garden. For the first time in years, they felt hope. They felt someone was watching out for them. And that someone was me. Karen's name became a warning whispered across the country. Don't end up like her. HOA presidents joked nervously at conferences, though the laughter was hollow. They knew the hammer could fall on any of them next. Washington had my reports, my evidence, my recommendations. Entire HOAs were being audited, restructured, and in some cases dismantled. Families were freed from decades of bogus fees and intimidation. Karen had called the sheriff once, screaming that I was trespassing on her land. She believed she held power because she held a clipboard and a list of rules. She thought she could fine, threaten, and bully her way into control. But power built on fear always crumbles. Now, as I sat on that porch, the evening sun bathing the fields in gold, I couldn't help but smirk at the irony. She wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, I made an example out of her. The cattle shifted in the distance, bells clinking gently as they moved toward water troughs. My neighbors, free men and women who no longer lived under her shadow, waved as they drove past, their trucks bouncing along the gravel road. Some honked, some slowed just long enough to tip their hats in respect. They knew the fight hadn't been just about me or my land. It had been about all of us. Karen lost her board. She lost her power. She lost her freedom the moment she stepped onto my ranch to vandalize it. But her story lived on, not as tragedy, not even as comedy, but as a parable of arrogance meeting justice. And me? I had embraced the role fate carved out for me. I was still a rancher, still a son of the soil, but I had also become something larger, an overseer of order, a guardian of fairness. Karen thought she could cage me with her HOA rules. She thought she could break me with fines. She thought the law was hers to twist. But in the end, the law wasn't hers. The land wasn't hers. It was mine. And now, so is every HOA in America.